in Central Florida. Navy soup salve helped us pump the upper Kissimmee River backwards for a few days, saving around 12,000 homes south of Orlando from flooding. They're true professionals who know how to deliver outstanding results. With these three elements in place, we embarked on the complex task of determining how to begin clearing the approximately 50,000 tons of concrete, asphalt, and steel from the Patapsco River. For context, that's over 200 Statues of Liberty worth of material. After conducting extensive engineering analysis, the Army Corps, in collaboration with our partners, developed an ambitious but feasible timeline. Our plan was to initially clear a 35-foot deep limited access channel by the end of April and restore the full 50-foot federal navigation channel by the end of May. Certified by the Coast Guard, the limited access channel was open to one-way vehicle traffic on April 25th, a week ahead of schedule. This channel could support approximately 70% of the port traffic, particularly the car carriers that are so important to Baltimore. To open up the full channel, we first had to execute the most difficult task, that of removing a section of bridge that had collapsed onto the bow of the Dali. I'm delighted to report that on Monday of this week, the team successfully used precision demolitions to cut the bridge away from the ship. Today, operations continue to remove the Dali from the southern edge of the federal channel. This will facilitate the removal of the remaining bridge wreckage from the river. We remain on track to open the full 700-foot wide by 50-foot deep federal channel by the end of May. In closing, we're tremendously proud to be part of the stellar unified team who was mentioned earlier, safely removing the bridge wreckage from the federal channel, allowing the Port of Baltimore to resume its role as a key supply chain node and vital economic engine. Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Next, Administrator Bhatt, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge on March 26th was a tragic event for Baltimore, Maryland, and the entire nation. While the collapse of the bridge itself was shocking, we must not lose sight of the devastating impact this tragedy has had on the victims and their families. The 6 victims were fathers, husbands, and friends in their homes and communities, and they were valued members of the construction workforce. We will always mourn these 6 individuals who lost their lives while working to strengthen our transportation system. I also want to thank the emergency responders who acted quickly to save lives. I have had the opportunity to visit the site of the bridge collapse, and while I have been engaged in a number of bridge-related incidents during my career, I have never seen anything at this scale. It is a monumental task to clean up the site and rebuild. And yet, as I appear before the committee today, I have a great feeling of optimism, witnessing the ability of industry and government entities to work together in times of calamity, as they have done in the weeks since the bridge collapse. Immediately following this catastrophic event, the Federal Highway Administration mobilized internally across multiple offices and externally with local, state, and federal partners to support the response. President Biden has been clear in this administration's commitment to reconstruct the bridge. Under Secretary Buttigieg's leadership, FHWA is actively coordinating with other operating administrations and offices within the United States Department of Transportation, the Maryland Department of Transportation, which includes the Maryland Transportation Authority and State Highway Administration, the City of Baltimore, U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and others to mitigate supply chain impacts, manage traffic, reopen the port, and ultimately reconstruct the bridge. FHWA is actively supporting the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation of the collapse. FHWA has been in direct communication with MDOT, Maryland DOT, regarding all possible options for reconstructing the bridge, and is committed to supporting these efforts so that the bridge can be reconstructed as quickly and safely as possible. It is critical that we reconstruct this vital connection for people and goods traveling along the East Coast. Ensuring that the I-695 corridor is open, operational, and safe for the traveling public at the earliest possible moment is a top priority. On March 28th, within hours of receiving the request for funding assistance from Maryland DOT, FHWA announced the immediate availability of $60 million in quick release emergency relief funds. These funds serve as a down payment towards initial costs, and additional emergency relief program funding will be made available as work continues. The administration is asking Congress to join it in demonstrating a commitment to aid in recovery efforts by authorizing a 100% federal cost share for rebuilding the bridge, consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. FHWA continues to provide wide-ranging technical assistance to Maryland DOT regarding contract procurement for debris removal, procurement for reconstruction operations, and project delivery strategies to reconstruct the bridge quickly and safely. FHWA also is working with Maryland DOT to ensure that the new bridge will be built to current design standards and in accordance with all applicable federal laws. On March 26, 2024, the day of the collapse, FHWA met with the National Transportation Liaisons from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the EPA to discuss each agency's respective emergency procedures and considerations to expedite the environmental review and permitting processes for the future reconstruction. FHWA continues to meet with federal resource agencies to discuss permitting. Thank you to the state, local, and federal entities who continue to collaborate in response to this tragic event, whether it is an event of this scale and complexity or the comparatively smaller but still impactful bridge incidents on I-95 in Philadelphia and on I-10 in Los Angeles. I am proud to lead an agency that is playing a part in showing the country what can happen when the government and industry come together with a common goal. There are no Democratic roads or Republican bridges. Transportation truly unites us. FHWA will continue to do everything it can to support the response. As the President has said, we will not rest until the cement has dried on the entirety of the new bridge. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. Now we'll go to Chair Homendy.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. With me today is our lead investigator on this accident, Marcel Muse, our acting director of Marine Safety, Eric Stolzenberg, and other dedicated NTSB staff. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss our ongoing investigation into the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. On behalf of the NTSB, I offer our heartfelt condolences to the families of all those who were lost in this tragedy, and our deepest sympathies to those who were injured or otherwise impacted by this event. I also want to thank our numerous federal and state partners for their support on scene and throughout this investigation. Yesterday, we released our preliminary report, which shows that the Dali experienced 4 total power outages. Preliminary information indicates that the March 25th blackouts were mechanically distinct from those that occurred on March 26th. 2 were related to routine maintenance in port. 2 were unexpected tripping of circuit breakers on the accident voyage. On the 25th, a blackout occurred when a crew member mistakenly closed an engine damper while he was working on the exhaust system in port. This effectively blocked the engine's exhaust gases from traveling out of the vessel's stack, causing the engine to stall. Vessel power was briefly restored, but insufficient fuel pressure to the online generator caused its speed to decrease. Its breaker opened, and a second blackout occurred. While recovering from this second blackout, the crew switched to a different transformer and set of breakers from those that had been in use for several months. Switching breakers is not unusual, but may have affected operations the very next day on the accident voyage. So the configuration of the breakers remains under investigation. On the 26th, when the ship was about 0.6 miles from the bridge, 1 high voltage and 1 low voltage breaker that were powering most of the vessel's equipment and lighting unexpectedly tripped. As a result, the vessel lost main propulsion. Bridge equipment also lost power, and the voyage data recorder lost system feeds. Bridge audio continued to be recorded. The crew was able to briefly restore power to the vessel, but another blackout occurred when a different breaker tripped. At this point, the ship was about 0.2 miles from the Key Bridge. The crew regained electrical power right before the Dali struck Pier 17, but they were unable to restore propulsion. The ship had an emergency generator, which automatically started following the first blackout on the 26th. However, The generator only powers systems like emergency lighting, navigation, radio equipment, alarms, and a steering pump that allowed for low-speed, limited rudder movements. It does not power propulsion, and without the propeller turning, the rudder was less effective. They were essentially drifting. We're still investigating the exact time the emergency generator started. Going forward, this is a complex investigation. Our investigators have been on scene consistently since this accident. In fact, they are on board the vessel as I testify today. It is unprecedented to be there that long. We will continue evaluating the design and operation of the Dali's power distribution system, including its breakers. Examination of damage to the vessel will continue when the ship is clear of debris and moved to a shoreside facility. We're also working with Maryland as they assess pier protection on their other bridges. And we're examining pier protection improvements that have been made following other bridge collapses resulting from marine vessel strikes that we have investigated in the past. Lastly, there are a lot of questions regarding the fuel. Our investigators found that the ship was running on low sulfur marine gas oil at the time of the accident, which it had been using since March 21st. We directed an independent lab to test all fuel stored on the ship, including the fuel that was being burned at the time of the accident. The test results did not identify any concerns related to the quality of the fuel. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you all, and now we'll turn to questions, and I'll let Rick answer the first one.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. First question's for Administrator Bhatt. You said that when you look at reconstruction of the bridge, you'll look at current standards consistent with law. Does the current law allow, in this a circumstance like this, a rebuild of a different kind of bridge in order to be eligible for either federal or for the cost share? Because you could build one under current standards, and that could be in violation of what the law under this circumstance allows you to do. So I'll walk through that a little bit.
Thank you for the question, sir. Yeah, I think what we're examining and working with Maryland DOT on, the original bridge was built in the 1970s, a truss bridge, which was common at the time. Today, most of the bridges that are being replaced that are truss bridges are being replaced by cable stay bridges. Different standards. Obviously, we're going to want to hear from the NTSB on their final results of that investigation. But under the law, what we want to do is when we're replacing a structure of that size, we want to build it to current standards. And Maryland DOT will be allowed to do that. What we want to make sure we're not doing is allowing for any quote unquote betterments that did not exist that would be then covered by the ER program.
Yeah. Admiral Gautier, the Corps has expended significant resources in the recovery effort. There's no mechanism for the Coast Guard has. There's no mechanism for the Coast Guard to recoup that funding, and you're not typically reimbursed for this kind of work. Yet, with a workforce shortage of about 10%, you're downgrading stations within the Coast Guard, not because of this incident, but that's just what's happening in the Coast Guard. We passed a Coast Guard authorization that gets us to $14.5 billion for 25 and $15 billion for 26. So we're not near the goal of a $20 billion service for 2030. So just as Congress moves forward with supplemental appropriations for the Key Bridge, how is the Coast Guard thinking about being part of that supplemental appropriation to get reimbursed for get some cost recovery for your work?
Yeah, thanks, Ranking Member. And I don't want to get ahead of the administration on the plans or the amounts and so on, the details of the supplemental. But the way you've articulated, first of all, we have been expending operating funds as we do during emergencies like this, like we do for hurricane responses and other things. And we've been keeping close tabs on those. And so far, we've spent about $20 million of direct and indirect funding on this particular response. But what we see in events like this and others like it is that we do what we call burn readiness, right? So we have to have other assets around the area work harder and to cover for the boats, aircraft, people who are working these. We've mobilized now, when I visited the command post, on average, we've had about 200 individuals at the peak in the command post per day. That's gone down. We're mobilizing them from around the country. In fact, most of them are from outside Baltimore right now. And so there's an opportunity cost from the commands that provide those individuals. And I think what this exposes, sir, is, and you know us well, is that the Coast Guard readiness is becoming more and more brittle as we fail to have the kind of consistent budgets reaching that 20 billion a year that the Coast Guard's articulated, reaching the 3 billion per year on our procurement, construction, and improvement, double what we actually receive in order to do the necessary capitalizations. And so this brittleness in our readiness manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. And we really do appreciate congressional support and ask for additional support for appropriations in the future.
Yeah, thanks. General Graham, now to you, kind of the same question, but last week the Corps reprogrammed $20 million in unused funds from FY 2020, including $1 million out of my district and from prior year funds. Do you have an estimate how many more dollars you might need to reprogram, first? And second, how are you thinking about a supplemental appropriations for cost recovery for the Corps?
Ranking Member Larson, thank you for that question. Similar to the Coast Guard, we certainly want to get ahead of the administration, but right now we've been able to use the project funds, and as your opening statement indicated, that dredging work that we had planned to do with those funds in this year will still need to be done. The emergency reprogramming that I referenced in my opening statement, most of that money we didn't need. So where does that money come from? Mainly it's bid savings. A lot of these projects had happened during favorable bid environment, and we were able to go back to those funds. A good example of a few years later, those claims have been adjudicated, and if we didn't have to pay that request, then we would unobligate those funds.
Mr. Chairman, if I could indulge me for a moment, not for a question, but I do want to let Chair Homendy know I'll need to absorb your first half of your report. It's rather technical. I'm not an engineer, but we'll absorb it and get back to you with some questions on it. And just as a data point for the committee, the Skagit River Bridge collapse in 2013 cost a total of $19 million for the insurer and took us 10 years to recover $19 million. So we should not be thinking of waiting to recover costs from insurance, the insurer of the carrier or the place first, because it took 10 years to get $19 million. If that's the average time it gets $19 million, we'll all be dead by the time we get the money back from this ocean carrier. So just a point, just a data point for folks. Thanks.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. I want to start by acknowledging the 6 workers who lost their lives as a result of the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Obviously, our deepest sympathies go out to their families and their loved ones. Hours after the Francis Scott Key Bridge tragically collapsed, President Biden came out and said it was his, quote, intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge. And further, he had, quote, directed his team to move heaven and earth to reopen the port and rebuild the bridge as soon as humanly possible. Administrator Bhatt, I have a series of questions here as we try to understand the mechanics of the situation before us. And if you would just give me a yes or no response in the interest of time. While the bridge was located on I-695 prior to its collapse, it wasn't actually considered a part of the interstate, but rather was Maryland State Route 695. Is that correct?
Yes.
The bridge had previously never received any federal funding. Is that correct?
Yes.
I understand that Federal Highways has since approved a request by Maryland to designate the bridge as interstate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Meaning the federal share for reconstruction under the emergency relief program will now be 90%. Is that correct?
Yes, instead of 80.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is a delta of 10% for a bridge that previously never received any federal funding.
Yes.
Okay. In your testimony, you mentioned that authorizing a 100% federal cost share would be consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. How many times has Congress authorized a 100% federal share for a fully collapsed bridge?
So I think the reference point we're using is the I-35W collapse in Minnesota.
Okay. Some say that we need 100% federal funding so we can get the rebuilding done quickly, but that's not how the ER program works. It's a reimbursement program, correct?
Absolutely.
As I understand the ER financing process, generally individual states, the division offices and the program office have a process to make sure that projects are ready to receive funding and work can be completed in a specified time period. Is that right?
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter if a project is getting 80% federal share, 90%, or even 100%. The reimbursement is based on project progress and delivery, correct?
Yes.
I just want to be clear that nothing is going to move faster if this is 100% federal funded versus 90% or any other percentage, whether the state contributes money or not. The process for awarding federal reimbursement is still the same, correct?
Can I just deviate from the yes, no for a second?
Go ahead.
Yes. However, the 10%, so this is the second largest ER request we've ever received, 2.2 billion for Katrina was the first one, so 1.7 to 1.9 billion dollars. So that 10% delta is about 170 to 190 million dollars for the state of Maryland that as they're programming out their multi-year, multi-billion dollar program, it may not be this project, but it may have impacts on other projects.
Okay, let me just briefly in the time. Going to expect any kind of waivers or anything like that on NEPA or any other regulatory compliance measures that would be customary on any other construction project?
So, sir, we would not waive NEPA or any of the environmental requirements, but what we have done is coordinated with our agencies who issue permits, and it is our intention, because the bridge previously existed in this relative footprint, that it would be likely a categorical exclusion, which would minimize the time.
Expand on categorical exclusion. What does that mean?
You know, when you go through NEPA, you can either do like a full environmental impact statement. We could get to a finding of no significant impact on environmental assessment. Categorical exclusion is sort of the more time-limited finding, and what is the reason we would use that basis here is because the bridge previously existed and we're putting a bridge back relatively in the same footprint.
You're putting it back in the same spot, but not necessarily, because you're probably going to use different kind of construction. Would there be some associated flow studies, for example, to address the new construction?
So that is why we are coordinating with our sister agencies who issue the permit, because it is, as I said, relatively in that same footprint, but probably going to use different piers. It's probably going to have a little bit of tweaking to the approaches, a different height than was there before. So that's why I can't say definitively that'll be a categorical exclusion. It's what we're working towards.
So it sounds to me like there's going to be a great deal of flexibility in the interest of getting this thing restored, rebuilt, and restoring traffic and commerce and everything associated with that bridge. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if flexibility is the right word. I think attention from the sister agencies and understanding that there is a desire to move quickly.
And I'm all for that. And I hope that in the future that other projects are given the same consideration because time is money, and understand that that's certainly the case here, but there are a lot of other projects out there pending that have cost millions in regulatory compliance fees that have really been delayed as a result. So thank you, and I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Bhatt, Department of Transportation data show that traffic crashes rose 29% on alternative routes in the weeks following the Key Bridge collapse. The same data show that it now takes between 2 and 4 times longer for drivers to travel those alternative routes. That traffic means trucks are delayed in reaching their destinations, commuters are late getting to their jobs or home to their families, and there is more air pollution and wasted fuel. How has the loss of the Key Bridge hurt traffic safety and reduced mobility for drivers in the Baltimore region?
Thank you for the question. I think, we saw in Philadelphia after I-95, we had that bridge collapse, that there was just all kinds of traffic moving through neighborhoods and trying to find their way. And I think a similar effect is happening in Baltimore. Usually when you have an impact where you remove a significant piece of infrastructure, traffic seems to level out after a while. That's not happening here in Baltimore to the same extent. And I think it's because of just the criticality of this artery. It's part of the Northeast Corridor. It's important for Maryland. It's important for Baltimore, but it's also important for the Northeast Corridor. And so, yes, there are trucks and vehicles moving through neighborhoods that they would not normally be on. And that's why it's so critically important that we move with as much speed as possible.
Administrator Bhatt, it is clear that we need to restore commerce to the Port of Baltimore and rebuild the bridge to improve safety and mobility in the region. The full Maryland delegation has proposed legislation to provide 100% federal share for the cost of the new bridge. I wholeheartedly support this legislation. What effect would the 100% federal share have on efforts to rebuild the bridge quickly?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I've spent a lot of time running state DOTs in my career. I've been on the private side, so I was with AECOM before this job that works on bridges across the globe. And I would just say what the benefit of the 100% share brings is just it removes an element of uncertainty. So right now, I think Maryland, and I have to commend Maryland DOT, just really been consummate professionals throughout this process. Right now, what they're contemplating is an ER shortage that we have told them about, that we have $3.7 billion in unmet needs as the Federal Highway Administration, with about $870 million available for nationwide ER efforts. And so we're telling them we believe that we'll have the ER funding there for you. And then they have the uncertainty of the 90% versus the 100%. We did remove the 80% uncertainty. And so as you're planning out these multi-year, multi-billion-dollar construction programs, not knowing whether or not that $170 million is going to be there, does it impact things right now at this moment? No, they're going to move forward. But as they're projecting out and as they're trying to build their construction program, other contractors, it's an element of uncertainty that would be helpful. And just to clarify on the 100%, obviously any insurance payments, as the ranking member had mentioned, would be reapplied. So I can pretty much with certainty guarantee this will not be 100% federally funded eventually, because we will recoup all of the insurance payments as possible, and they will go back into the ER funds. But as the ranking member mentioned, we don't want to wait through all of the litigation and the NTSB investigations, insurance issues for that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this together. It's very informative. Thank you, witnesses. Last week, the Army Corps notified congressional offices that they would be utilizing the Emergency Reprogramming Authority to the program to reprogram approximately $33 million of previously appropriated operation and maintenance, harbor maintenance trust fund dollars for recovery costs imposed by the collapse of the Key Bridge. Nearly $1 million was reappropriated from Florida and projects in Florida without any request for input from congressional delegation, the state, or the people. While the recovery effort in Baltimore is important, this reprogramming of the funds represents a blatant disregard for Florida and desperately needed improvements to our water resources and infrastructure. General Graham, if these recently reprogrammed funds were deemed to be in excess, why did the Corps let these funds sit for years and not act sooner to reprogram them towards projects locally in Florida? And will the Corps plan to reimburse the South Atlantic Division for these funds?
Congressman Webster, thank you for that question. The example I used earlier of the some of the funds that we had set aside for a contract when a contractor put a claim, that was from Jacksonville, and that was from the Jacksonville district, and it was Jacksonville Harbor. So in this case, those funds, I think $300-some thousand, are no longer needed for the Jacksonville Harbor project. So those funds in particular that we had set them aside for a need and that need didn't materialize, we will not seek recoupment for those. We did do this work, this emergency reprogramming work, Congressman, very rapidly. And we, as I stated in my opening statement, we haven't used this authority at this scale for 15 years. And we are a little clunky at it in terms of our notification to you and your staffs. And I'll use Jacksonville District as an example, if there are some of those funds that they do find a need for, we'll figure out a way to make sure that projects continue. To your first comment on some of those old funds that have been sitting out there for a while, why haven't we cleaned up the books sooner? Sir, you're absolutely right. We should have.
As you know better than most, that the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deep Horizon oil spill. The National Incident Commander's report concluded the state's efforts resulted in the political and social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure and governance. It appears that the press reports that meetings with Maryland state officials and a number of staff member trips to the wreck site, that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and then has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during the incidents such as the Dali?
Congressman, if that's for me, I can't agree more with your statement. As the Chief of Staff for Admiral Allen on the Deepwater Horizon spill, and now being someone who has been witness to the terrific work in the unified effort in this one, it's been very, very different in terms of cooperation and collaboration. Underpinning that is the absolute necessity and the benefit of the incident command system under the National Incident Management System framework. That has served this response incredibly well. It's the doctrine of the U.S. Any agency, entity, Army Corps, state can come together with a common lexicon, a common way of planning to come together and make this work. But I'd also like to highlight a real difference that has made a difference. And that is that elected leadership and the operational leadership has been connected in a very constructive way. From Governor Moore to Mayor Scott to members of Congress from the Maryland delegation, they have taken it upon themselves to get regular updates and a great interest in the progress in the response. They have handled for the Unified Command a lot of the public affairs and external communications in a very constructive way. And they've actually provided the trade space for the operational response to continue on without pressure, without being rushed. It's been very constructive.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for holding this important hearing on the federal response to the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Maryland. Further extend my condolences to the families of the 6 individuals who lost their lives during the collapse. Thank our esteemed witnesses for appearing here today, especially Administrator Bhatt, who was with us in Memphis on Monday. Appreciate your coming to see the I-55 bridge and the urgent need to replace it across the Mississippi River in Memphis, West Memphis. That is, of course, as you well know, a national treasure to have transportation going across the country there at I-40. We had the I-40 bridge have a problem last year and shut down. I-55 bridge could have the same problem. Because it's in the New Madrid earthquake fault zone, which is predicted to occur. It's been predicted for about 20 years, but it's going to occur, and it's more likely sooner than later. As y'all look at the damages to the Key Bridge, which were caused partially, I think, because it wasn't built to withstand that large of a boat. It could have been, maybe the piers could have been buttressed and made it more stable. Is that correct? Mr. Bhatt, can you answer?
Thank you, Representative Cohen. And yes, it was good to spend some time with you in Memphis looking at that bridge. I think one of the things we're waiting for, and it was great to see the preliminary report from the NTSB, but I think we're going to be working closely with the NTSB just to figure out exactly what types of protection might be needed for bridges and what could have been possible. But again, I don't want to step into the NTSB realm.
I'm sorry, please.
Thank you, sir. For the Key Bridge, we are obviously looking at, there were 2 dolphins on the east side, 2 on the west side. They're rather small, and the vessel just sort of bypassed the dolphins. What ended up striking the pier was the starboard side of the bow that hit the column. The pier protection around the column itself is timber, concrete, a little bit of steel, but it's very close into the pier itself. Other structures that we're looking at have pier protection that comes out farther so that a vessel can't get to the column. Other dolphins are much larger, so we are looking at other structures across the United States to see what might be good models. I think the key here is you have a bridge that was opened in 1977, and over time, it's not the bridge that's getting larger, it's not the waterway that's getting larger, it's the vessels that are getting larger, and not just width, but height with containers. And so it's important that states and other bridge owners are looking at, from a risk assessment standpoint, what is now going through, what is the vessel traffic, and how is our infrastructure protected?
So were the bridges built after 1977 that were built in a fashion that they would have been able to withstand such an impact?
You have to, yeah.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. It's an important question. We are working with our state DOT partners to identify all of the bridges that are subject to, seagoing vessels, also, in the Great Lakes region, barge traffic on the Mississippi and other waterways. I think what this bridge incident has done is driven home that need to look at many of our bridges, which are older, and look at that protection, and we're going to rely on the NTSB recommendations. Again, there was a lot of force. I've heard different, analogies of the force, the equivalent of a rocket ship taking off. And so we just want to be careful in our consideration of how we both protect and build bridges in the 21st century as they're dealing with these new potential threats.
Thank you. I just would like to urge you, as I did in Memphis, that we need to look at preventative measures so we don't have another Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster. And earthquakes would cause that. And there's no place in the United States, I think, more vulnerable than the New Madrid Fault and the I-55 bridge that was built before there were seismic standards that were not part of the bridge. So it's deficient, needs to be replaced, and hope that you'll look in terms, just as this disaster, at bridges that we fund under the bipartisan infrastructure bill be ones that might be susceptible to either God created, I hate to say God, I hate to give God responsibility, but the disasters that are caused by other than man-made disasters. I yield back, and I thank you for coming, and Elvis thanks you too.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll begin by just offering my condolences to the family, and I think it underscores, the circumstance underscores how potentially horrific, almost unimaginable, what might be seen as mundane work can end up being at a critical moment. It is unimaginable. If you can imagine yourself at 2 or 3 in the morning falling, 100, 200 feet into the water, steel and concrete crashing around you. With that, Administrator Bhatt, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is was a toll facility that never received any federal funding prior to the collapse, right?
Yes, sir.
And how much revenue did the state of Maryland receive or generate from the bridge on an annual basis, if you know?
Sir, I'd have to double check. I don't want to give you a false number. I'll
Okay,
come back to you on that.
I didn't know if you would have a different figure than I do. I've got about 56.8 million in 2023, just for your reference. So that's what they were taking. And under the current law and under this administration's plan, the bridge would get 100% share. So the federal government would pay 100% of that. And while you say that this is consistent with bridge collapse emergencies in the past, and I think you're referring to the I-35 collapse, that was not a toll bridge, right? That was part of the interstate system. And so my questions, I guess, center around payment for this. I think we can all agree that we probably and shouldn't wait for the insurance companies and the litigators to work it out, but Maryland had insurance on the bridge, didn't they?
Sir, I'm aware of one policy that Maryland has for $350 million.
$350 million, right?
Yes.
So that should, by all rights, you would assume, be actioned and go towards paying for a portion, whatever portion of the bridge reconstruction it would pay for, right? It would.
Absolutely, sir. I have yet to go through and have
I
our
understand.
lawyers figure out exactly what is in there. But yes, whatever portion of that 350 million we would apply.
So I guess when you say consistent with past emergencies, as you already said, the relief fund is 3.7 billion behind. We're 35 trillion this month in debt at the federal level. And I wonder if you think it's fair that the American taxpayer should not only pay to reconstruct the bridge, but then pay tolls after which to use the infrastructure they just paid for in their taxes. Is that because you're going to set a new precedent here? And is that the precedent we're going to set? Or is there some plan to recoup the cost of reconstruction of the bridge? And I think according to the figures we've heard today, upwards of $2 billion, a bridge that originally cost $60.3 million. Is there some plan to recoup that and send that back into the disaster relief fund or to the highway fund, which continually needs massive infusions from the general fund just to stay afloat? What's the plan?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Very important questions, and I appreciate your interest. So let me just try to quickly go through that. Where this was a Maryland state facility before, now it's been designated as part of the interstate system. They were free before to collect their tolls and use them, for, maybe Port of Baltimore, whatever they were using them for. Now, since this has been federalized as a facility and going forward when the tolls are restored, as part of the interstate system, they'll have to use those for Title 23 eligible funding. So whether it's the maintenance of the existing bridge or other Title 23 highway purposes in Maryland. So the American taxpayer will be benefiting from those tolls. In terms of the precedent, if it was a pre-existing toll facility, they are allowed to toll the facility going forward. But again, it would be using Title 23 eligible expenditures on those tolls.
I understand the Title 23 expenditures and understand that they'd be used for surface transportation in Maryland, but you're asking the taxpayers from across the country to pay for it. And if you're from Washington State, likely you're never going to travel across that bridge, but you're sure going to pay for it. And as long as we're setting precedent, I think it would be appropriate at least to consider reimbursing through the tolls the emergency fund or the transportation fund for the entire country before all of the money goes right back to the state that's going to be receiving it, where the bridge resides, which arguably I think can be said was not prepared to withstand the traffic impact that it had. Meanwhile, it's it's right there. I mean, it's not like it was a surprise that the bridge is there and ships are going under it and this could happen. So with that in mind, you know, with the time that I've already expended and expired, I hope you would consider a plan to reimburse the taxpayer under horrific debt right now, who can't afford their groceries, their gas bills, their daycare bills for the cost of this bridge, for which one state has been receiving all the money for its entire existence, and apparently is going to receive all the money from the tolls for the rest of its existence. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the hearing, witnesses, Vice Admiral and General, you and your teams, and the support organizations that you've contracted with are doing extraordinary work, and we thank you for that. The issue before this committee was pretty much laid out by the chairman in his opening remarks. And I would suggest that we have an opportunity to clarify the responsibilities, some of which we heard from the previous member just a moment ago. A couple of things here. First of all, the notion, President Biden is correct. Okay, we'll put up the full cost of reconstruction. However, that legislation should be written in such a way that the federal government will be reimbursed for any money received in the liability issues. The $350 million that the state of Maryland had as an insurance policy on the bridge, as well as whatever other liability payment may come from lawsuits against the shipping company and the owners of the ship. So if we should, and this should be really the work of this committee, is to carefully structure the legislation so that the federal government, ponying up the 100% at the outset, would be fully reimbursed by any revenues. My colleague raised an interesting point about tolls. We should consider that and how that fits into it, and keep in mind the entire interstate system where tolls are collected in various places across the United States. So those are things that are out there. There's also one other issue that I want to encourage this committee to deal with, in addition to recovering whatever money might be available from lawsuits. And that is the Limit of Liability Act of 1851. It seems as though perhaps even that precedes the law in Arizona, which dealt with a different issue. That Limit of Liability Act really has to change. And I would urge the committee to take up this issue. I intend to present to the committee at the appropriate time a piece of legislation to do so, so that the owners of these vessels would be held responsible for the cost of their mistakes. And that right now, that limited liability would hold that the owner of the ship would be limited to $40-some million, even though the ship is worth $90 million or more, and the damage is somewhere around $2 billion, not including the cost of the recovery issues and the expenses that the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers are now incurring. So my point here is to raise this policy issue and really the work of this committee as we go forward. I think the chairman correctly pointed out that we don't need to do much for the next couple of months, but this year we have to pass legislation to clarify the ability of the federal government to receive any funds that are available from various lawsuits that are out there. And also, this committee should, since it is our jurisdictional area, deal with this 1851 law that limits the liability of the ship owner to any accident and problem that they may cause. Now, I don't know if this is an appropriate question for the general and the vice admiral, but you're welcome to jump in if you'd like. But I think, Mr. Bhatt, and if you might comment on this issue about how we might structure legislation to recover whatever damages may be in the future from either insurance or lawsuits. You can look for help, but you won't.
No,
find
I just, you referenced them and I just,
No,
I'm taking a lot of the
it's
answers.
all yours.
I don't want to, happy to share the time. So under the ER program, under the existing law as it states, any insurance monies that are recouped for any ER event across the country do go directly back into the ER fund. So the ranking member mentioned the $19 million Skagit River Bridge, and I think it was actually about 16.6 million that was recovered through insurance, went directly back in, but as he said correctly, 10 years after the incident. So whether it's the $350 million insurance policy that Maryland has existing, or post-investigation and post legal activity going on for as long as that may be, we will recover all of that money and send it back in. But as you correctly point out, there is some questions about how much liability for the ship owner that is out there.
That is a question really should be addressed to the Coast Guard, who might want to comment on it, but I'm out of time now, so I will yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Babin, you're recognized.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and your testimonies. I think there's definitely some resentment among my colleagues and the American public about this incident. The perception here is really frustrating, and you've already addressed some of these, but I'd like to ask my questions. If you zoom out, the Singapore flag vessel crashes into and completely destroys a historic bridge, kills 6 construction workers, and is now trying to avoid liability for the incident. People have a lot of questions. Is it safe for foreign flag vessels to operate in U.S. waterways? Are other bridges safe? I've heard a number of questions wondering whether their bridges are safe. Was this incident a result of foul play or negligence? What can we do to prevent this from ever happening again, and who is going to pay for this thing? And I appreciate you all for coming and answering questions. My first question is for Admiral Gautier. If anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to jump in. I know this whole response is a great team effort. But first off, I'm told the Coast Guard is doing a great job leading the way in the unified response in Baltimore. So I want to thank you and the Coast Guard for your commitment and all of the hard work that you and the Coast Guard have done. As you all know better than most, the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deepwater Horizon oil spill a few years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. The National Incident Commander's report concluded social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure governance. It appears from press reports, meetings with Maryland state officials, and member and staff trips to the wreck site that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and that the response has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during incidents such as the Dali collision?
Congressman, thank you very much, first off, for the compliments to the Coast Guard. And I just have to also acknowledge the leadership of Colonel Pinchasson, Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel Butler, Jim Harkins, and Jeff Donahoe, who are the state incident commanders. It's a fantastic leadership team. To answer your question, the incident command system is absolutely a fundamental principle by which this incident response has been successful. It's part of U.S. doctrine under the National Incident Management System. It's how we respond to hurricanes, oil spills, other types of incidents just like this. I think we now have a great deal of practice in the United States since the Deepwater Horizon in doing this. And I think what I will just observe is that this particular incident had a very tight connection between the operational commanders who were running the incident and elected leaders who all shared the same objectives, The elected leaders took the time and effort, governor, mayor, members of Congress, to keep up to date on what was going on and to provide the trade space to allow these folks to get on with the response.
Okay, thank you. Second question I'd like to address to Administrator Bhatt. I'd like to talk about the path forward from here for the Key Bridge. What is the plan to replace the bridge? My constituents are not wanting to pay for this thing. In my view, the company or the country responsible for the incident should be footing the bill, not the U.S. taxpayer. If the U.S. is ultimately going to pay for this bridge, it better come out of funds that we've already allocated. President Biden and Speaker Pelosi authorized trillions for infrastructure, and that should be including bridges. The last thing I want to do is to vote to spend another $1 or $2 billion on a new bridge. So Administrator Bhatt, talk to me on what you see as a path forward here on payment for this thing.
Thank you, Congressman. And just in terms of the rebuild path, Maryland DOT plans to issue their RFP close to Memorial Day. They'll select a preferred team in August, and then they're looking at construction completion in 2028 is the preliminary schedule. And in terms of the payment, as I've stated, right now there's a preliminary estimate,